Hi, my name is Korame, and this is going to be my guide for Augmentation Evokers for The War Within. A little background on myself, which I always like to do for guides, so you know that you can trust what I'm going to tell you. I played Augmentation last year on Farok, and we got World 21st, or US 6, whatever ranking you care about, and I'm planning on playing Augmentation Evoker in this upcoming raid. And I've been prepping in all this time to play Augmentation Evoker. So in this video, I'm going to make it both new user-friendly, meaning if you haven't played Aug before, I'm going to go over all that, and also I'm going to have at the end mostly just a section of like all the changes and everything that's different from Emergensil, which was the last like relevant prog raid if you're coming back to Augmentation in The War Within. So if you are a returning Augmentation player, I suggest you go down to timestamps and go to where it says stats, talents, all that kind of good stuff. That's where I'm going to talk about like the things that are kind of changing with our gameplay in this new raid. But if you are a newer Augmentation player, that's what this whole entire video is going to be for. Your main source of damage as an Augmentation Evoker is going to be Ebon Might. You're going to cast this on raid as often as you can and try and get as high uptime as you can. It's going to be buffing up to 4 other players in your raid with 5% of their primary stat, whatever it is, and it's going to be based on your main stat. Which basically means that your main stat, being Intellect, is going to be the most important stat that you can have. Now, it comes with a base of 10 seconds and a 30-second cooldown. There are 2 ways that after you've cast a spell that you can, or I should say 2 main ways after you've cast a spell that you can extend its duration. The first is to have more Mastery. This stat is going to increase the base duration. So Mastery is going to snapshot when you actually cast the spell. So you have a certain amount of Mastery when you go and cast a spell, instead of just casting and adding a 10-second buff, instead it's going to be a baseline of, let's say, 16 seconds. The second major way that you can extend the duration of Ebon Might is through casting 4 different spells. The first of these spells is going to be your major cooldown, which is Breath of Aeons. Breath of Aeons is on a 2-minute cooldown, and the amount of damage that it's going to do is based on the amount of damage that your party or your entire raid is doing. So ideally you want to cast it when other people in your raid are also using their own CDs. The next 2 spells I will talk about together, which are your Empower spells. The first one is Fire Breath. Every single Evoker spec has access to this spell. You basically charge it up or rank it up, but no matter how much you charge or rank it up, it's going to do the same amount of damage. It's just a difference of if you charge it up more, it does more upfront damage. If you charge it up less, then it does more damage over time. In general, you're only going to be wanting to charge this up to the first rank. Your second Empower spell and the third spell that you can use in order to extend the duration of Ebon Might is going to be Upheaval. Only Augmentation Evokers have access to this spell, the other 2 Evoker specs do not. Similar to Fire Breath, no matter how much you charge it, it's going to do a similar amount of damage. The more you charge it, the bigger it gets. When you cast it like it says, it does an upheaval. Now this isn't very important for raid because most bosses are going to be immune to this. This is more important if there are adds on a raid boss maybe, but mostly for Mythic Plus. For the most part, you'll only be doing this to the 1 ring charge. Fourth way to extend Ebon Might is going to be basically your most cast spell, which is Eruption. Eruption uses a resource called Essence. Every single Evoker uses this resource. You come with a baseline of 5 Essence, but there is a talent you can take in order to have 6 Essence. Every single Essence takes between 2 and 3 seconds in order to recharge. After you've used all of your other ways in order to extend your Ebon Might, you basically keep pressing Eruption until you're out of Essence, and then eventually your Ebon Might will fall off because you won't have any ways to recharge anymore, and then you're going to wait until you can cast your next Ebon Might. In between that time, you're going to be using your main filler spell, which is Living Flame. Every single Evoker again has access to this spell. The main thing to note here is that the 4 ways I said to extend Ebon Might, Breath of Aeons, Fire Breath, Upheaval, and Eruption, you want to make sure that you're only casting those when you have Ebon Might up, because you want to use them to extend Ebon Might, and you never ever want to cast those when you do not have Ebon Might up. Now let's talk about how you control who Ebon Might buffs. So on default, if you just cast Ebon Might, it's just going to go on 4 damage dealers in a raid. If you're in a Mythic Plus and there's not going to be 4 damage dealers, it's going to go on your healer and tank. But inside of a raid, it's going to always prefer choosing 4 damage dealers, and it's going to do this based on proximity, meaning whoever is closest to you. Now, you can control who Ebon Might goes on with a buff called Prescience. So Prescience is something that you have 2 charges of, and it recharges. Basically, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to put out your Presciences before you Ebon Might, and then the Ebon Might is guaranteed to ignore like the proximity rule and just always go on the targets that you have Prescience on. Now this is where Aug gets very tricky, is knowing who to buff and when to buff. You always want to be buffing people that are ideally inside their CDs, whoever's doing their most damage. And that means that you have to find like basically like 25-second intervals in the fight and look at each 25-second interval and decide who is doing the most damage, so who should be putting Prescience on, and when should be casting this, and all that kind of stuff. In this video, I am not going to go into depth on that. Instead, I'm going to point you to another video I have that basically goes a bit more into depth on how to identify who those people are. It uses some tools and also some weak words to make doing that much easier, because the reality of going through a 10-minute fight and memorizing who to be buffing and when isn't very good. And so I'm going to show you a weak word that's going to help you out with that a lot. But I put it in a whole separate video because otherwise this video would be a monster. Before I go any further, I want to give you a basic idea of the ebb and flow. I'm going to give you a very simplified rotation instead of the full rotation just to start, so that you get an idea. So before you, pretend we're going to a pull, you're going to want to cast Prescience on your 2 targets. Obviously I don't have any party members with me, so I'm just going to cast them on myself. Then I'm going to want to cast Ebb and Might. And then I want to use my first 2 Empower spells. So they're going to be Fire Breath to 1 rank and Upheaval to next rank. After that, I want to cast Eruption. And I'm going to cast Eruption basically until I run out of Essence. This is my Essence right here, and this yellow bar is going to be my Ebb and Might. After I'm out of Essence, I'm going to start casting Living Flames. And then now I do have Essence to cast another Eruption, but I don't have Ebb and Might up anymore, so I'm not going to press it. Okay, getting a little bit more into it, that's your basic rotation while you're doing it. This is more what your opener is going to look like. It's going to look like on pull, you're going to cast your 2 Presciences on current targets. You're going to press Ebb and Might. And you want to use my major CD, which is Breath of Aeons, Fire Breath, Upheaval, and then I want to spam as much as I can. Now, the important things that I'm watching here is that I'm making sure I'm only casting this inside my Ebb and Might uptime, and I'm watching my Prescience charges. I don't want them to cap, so I need to make sure before they hit 2 that I use that charge. Otherwise, the charge is going to get wasted or munched. You always want to make sure you're recharging one of your Prescience charges. Now, another important thing here to note about Prescience that I didn't explain to you yet, that I'm going to now, is that just because you Prescience someone else, it doesn't mean that if you recast Ebb and Might while it is up on 4 targets already, let's say you have 4 targets that have Ebb and Might on them, right? 2 of them have Prescience, 4 Ebb and Might targets. Your Ebb and Might comes off cooldown, but you still have your current Ebb and Might buff. And let's say you have a Prescience on one other target. Let's say it's your DK. That DK has Prescience, but he has no Ebb and Might. If you cast Ebb and Might again, well, that original Ebb and Might is up, it's going to just stay on those 4 single targets. It's not going to move off of one of the targets that don't have Prescience onto that 3rd target who has Prescience. If you wanted to go on those new targets that have Prescience, you need to let Ebb and Might drop, which is why in that example, even though you see that I could refresh my Ebb and Might, most of the time what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to let it fall off before you cast it again, because you want it to go to the new targets, because most of the time when you're looking at these 27-second intervals, it's going to be a new set of targets that are optimal instead of being the same targets for the entirety of 54 seconds. So, getting a little bit deeper there, but yeah, I wanted to show you that just so you get a basic understanding of the class before we go any further. Now that I've given you a kind of idea of what a rotation is like, I'm going to move on to some of our smaller CDs that aren't as important to the core of the rotation, as well as utility and defensives. These things are especially important and what makes Aug so good in Raid. Okay, so first off, I want to talk to you guys about Tip the Scales. It's something that you saw me press in that little thing there. Tip the Scales is a 2-minute CD that we get from our Evoker tree. It makes your next Empower spell instant cast. This CD is going to be especially important this tier because we have a new talent within the hero talent we're playing this time, which is Chrono Warden, which gives you this buff called Temporal Burst whenever you press it, and also helps you generate a Thread of Fate. I'm going to talk a little bit more about like how to use that towards the end instead of talk about it now and have to repeat myself later when I talk about talents. Aug also has 2 buffs that you want to cast pre-pull with longer durations. The first one is Source of Magic. You're going to cast this on a healer. It has a 30-minute duration and it persists through death. So all you really need to do is cast it, get a weak aura that reminds you to cast it again, and you should never have to press this during combat. This should just be something like a maintenance buff pull that you do before. And the other one is going to be Blistering Scales. The Blistering Scales is something that you do want to cast before the pull happens. However, it is something that you're also going to have to refresh during the pull. It's something that you want to put on the tank. There's especially bosses like Brew Twister, which do a lot of tank damage, and this extra armor is really helpful. You could also take a talent that gives it a small absorb, and it can be used as a minor defensive as well. Speaking of defensives, Evoker has the best defensive in the game, and that is a cheat death. So Defy Fate is on a 6-minute cooldown. Outside of that baseline, Evokers don't have a lot of auto like healing tankiness, so you need to be good at using your own defensives. Another really OP defensive we have that gets criminally, I don't want to say underused, but not used very well, is Renewing Blaze. So this heals you for 100% of the damage you take over its duration afterwards. But basically that means that you need to make sure that whenever there's like incoming damage, especially if there's like incoming like taking damage and stuff like that, because usually that's like a lot more damage than just like a big hit, because taking damage is more spread out. So you want to make sure that you're pressing your Renewing Blaze. It does so much healing. It is so helpful for keeping you alive. In addition to that, Evoker also has a regular wall, like a DR, which is Obsidian Scales, and it has 2 charges on a 1.5 minute CD. Again, really, really good. Great defensives if you're actually using them correctly. You also bring some tankiness to your group. This is mainly with something like Zephyr. So Zephyr in your 20-man raid is only going to go on 5 people at a time, so if you have multiple Evokers, it's pretty common for you both to press it at the same time. Weird as that is, because that's not usually how raid CDs go. However, it gives the 5 people that are going to be closest to you 20% avoidance, and also some movement speed is a nice little bonus. You can also get a 30% health shield for yourself and another by taking this talent with Rescue. So Rescue is something that you can use, and it's pretty unique to Evoker, to pick someone up and take them with you somewhere else. It's a great like button for like movement and utility, especially on fights that have like knockbacks. But also, if you don't need to use it for movement, it's a great defensive for yourself and one other person, especially if you think about like priest healers in your raid. You're going to be gripping them very often with Rescue anyways, and also they would also appreciate the shields on parts of the raid where there's a lot of damage. So most often I always keep a macro with my priest healer in it. As far as movement CDs go, Evokers of course have Hover. This allows you to cast things like Eruption, Living Flame, and Ebon Might on the go, although this does not allow you to do things like Fire Breath and Upheaval while you're moving. Thankfully, Evokers only have to ever rank those up to 1, so it doesn't really matter that much. You also have access to Time Spiral, which is a raid cooldown that gives everybody access to 1 extra movement ability depending on the class. There's variables of how good this is. It's not very good for priests, but it is really good for some other classes. And on a choice node with that is going to be Spatial Paradox, which you can give to a healer. And this is going to allow them to move to casting as if they have Hover. The other nice thing about this is that it does increase your range. So Evokers do have really short arms, and sometimes you having that extra range with Spatial Paradox is going to be really good. So now we're going to start focusing on some of the changes that are coming for Evokers in the War Within. So Blizzard has done a pretty good job of shifting some of the power of Evoker out of just buffing people and into their own spells. Chrono Warden is looking to be our most viable hero talent choice in the War Within. So due to some of the talent nodes, like this one right here, that has a chance to make your next Ebon Might 50% more effective, crit is now going to be equal to mastery in our stat prior when you're playing Chrono Warden. So your stat priority is going to be crit is equal to mastery. It's greater than haste, which is way better than versatility. Versatility still absolutely sucks for Evokers, unfortunately. Chrono Warden itself does not change that much inside of our playstyle. However, it does kind of change the talents we take, and there are some new talents that are going to also change our playstyle going forward. The first thing I want to talk about is Molten Embers and Tip the Scale. So Molten Embers is a newer capstone that was introduced at the end of Dragonflight that makes it so that whenever Fire Breath is up on a target, it makes it so that we do more damage against them. Again, staying within the theme of the Evoker doing a bit more damage and having more damage baked into themselves with the introduction of that talent. So ideally we want to have as much Fire Breath uptime as possible. Since we're usually only rank 1ing our Fire Breath, this doesn't change that much. The only thing this could change is when you tip the scales your Fire Breath after your Breath of Aeons. So in the Chrono Warden tree, you do get temporal bursts whenever you press Tip the Scales, which means you're going to want to be using your Tip the Scales inside of your Breath of Aeons, and there's a bit of contention right now on how to handle this. So if you look at the Wowhead guide or other guides, a lot of them will just say it's not a damage loss to just still Tip the Scales your Fire Breath, and other people will say, well, you can still Tip the Scales before your Fire Breath to start the temporal displacement and then use a cancel macro. However, when I'm looking at logs and what other people are doing this week, some of the top Evokers in top guilds are actually just casting Fire Breath and then pressing Tip the Scales and pressing Upheaval. So my opinion is to usually just do whatever the top players are doing because they're smarter than everyone. However, based on the math I've seen, it doesn't seem like it's really gonna have that much consequence if you just play the way you were before. It's just something to be aware of. Maybe some math will come out later that they're wrong or I'm wrong or someone's wrong. But I just wanted to put that all on the table right now, and I'm sure it'll be decided in a week. This video will already be out. Another change in our talents is that we are now taking reverberations. This increases our upheaval damage. The reason for this is that within the Chrono Warden tree, we do have a node that increases our upheaval damage, and then also our tier set is also going to feed into more upheaval damage. So what's this going to result in is when you're looking at your damage breakdown, upheaval is going to be much, much higher than it was last year. Another kind of different talent that we're playing now is Imminent Destruction. This makes your eruption do more damage and only costs 1 essence, so after you land in your Breath of Aeons, you're going to get lots and lots of casts of this off. This talent, I will say, is a little bit awkward because you're going to get a major extension, especially if you're in Lust, on your initial Ebb and Might after you do your Breath of Aeons and you get like so many casts of your eruption and stuff like that. And you're kind of just going to be like, okay, well, I need my Ebb and Might to fall off so I can cast my next one because I want to buff other people. And to me, it feels a little bit awkward. But I think the talent is too good to not take. So just keeping that in mind, and you're open that you're going to find yourself having to just like start casting Living Flame a little bit earlier than you normally would. Something else that Chrono Warden is bringing is this new talent called Golden Opportunity. This has a chance to make your next prescience basically like our 4 set was in Emergicil, where that prescience would have a increased buff time. This is, in my mind, more of a nuisance than anything because you have no control over when it's proccing, you don't know when it's going to proc, and then you're kind of left in an on-the-fly moment of having to buff someone and knowing that they're going to be getting your next buff and just kind of like thinking about it and trying to figure it out like on the fly, which is kind of cool, but it's not always that fun in practice. And the last 2 things I want to talk about are the falling out of Aspect's favor. So this was majorly nerfed how much health it gives, so it's not really worth the talent points anymore, and it could be usually just redistributed everywhere else. I guess if there's like maybe like some kind of one-shot or something where you really need that extra 1% health, you can take it, but for the most part, you're usually going to skip this one. The other one is, some people are talking about playing time skip. This has been more of a thing talked about in keys, but it's a possibility in raid, especially when there are damage amps on certain bosses. So just to keep that in mind, I personally hope this isn't a thing, but there is a possibility that time skip gets played this raid. I do have a regular talent loadout down in the description, and the last thing I want to mention is I have a whole video kind of going over the weak aura and UI and tools I use in order to buff targets and get frame glows and all that kind of stuff that I'm using in this expansion if you want to check it out and make your life a little bit easier. Other than that, thank you so much and good luck in the War Within.